Give us free. Give us free. Give us free.
Your Honor, please instruct the defendant that he cannot disrupt these proceedings with such out.
Give us free.
If we are to have any semblance of order in this court, Your Honor.
Give us
free.
Give us free.
Keep crying out, give us free, or anything else for
Give
that matter.
us
But
free.
I'm trying to question this witness.
Give us free. Give us free.
Okay guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. So I've been out for like 2 weeks. I'm sorry about that, but let's say that these last 2 weeks have been crazy. Tests, elections. I've also been sick for a while, but I'm okay now. I'm okay. It's like usual stuff. Anyway, so I told you in the last introduction, or the introduction to the last video, that this one would be especially longer than usual because the movement towards independence would also, in a sense, be covering how the Caribbean people responded to oppression. Alright, so let me not make this video any longer than it has to be and actually get into it. So today, as I said, I'd be covering how the Caribbean people, responded to oppression and genocide, so resistance, revolutions, the R-words, rebellions, as well as the development of peasant groups. And then we'll move straight into the movement towards independence, where we'll talk about political enfranchisement, let's say universal adult suffrage, internal self-government, economic enfranchisement, as well as the different entrepreneurial activities that the Caribbean people undertook while they were moving towards independence, as well as how they used those as an way to resist oppression. By now, you guys probably realize that I like to go in chronological order, makes things easier to remember. So, firstly, let's talk about an event with the Europeans and the indigenous people. Now, a major event is something I'm just going to call it La Navidad Hispaniola, the part where the Taino people went down with Christopher Columbus's men. All right, so it was Christmas Eve, and that's December 24, 1492, I believe. Christopher Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria, was destroyed. It was wrecked beyond repair. And the flagship is just the ship that, the main ship really, the one that Columbus traveled on. All right, and the Arawak people on the island of Hispaniola, they were very hospitable. They invited Christopher Columbus and his men onto the island, to stay, like set up a camp and stuff until they got their stuff sorted out, right? What Christopher Columbus did was he went back to Spain on the Nina because he came on the Santa Maria along with two other ships, the Nina and the Pinta, right? But he went back on the Nina to Spain. And what he did, he left about 39 men on the island of Hispaniola to trade precious metals, as well as to kind of safeguard the island for when he returned. When Christopher Columbus came back in about 11 months' time, he found that all 39 men that he had left in Hispaniola were dead. They were dead. What happened was the Taino people, they killed them. It's believed that either the Spanish men that Christopher Columbus had left were either abusing the Tainos by shooting at their feet with their guns, or they just overstayed their welcome. And just that. However, we also saw different uprisings and rebellions really again with involving the indigenous people, because there was like a 1520 war in Cuba, and there was also a 1513 uprising in Puerto Rico. We also saw the formation of Maroon groups, and the term Maroon is derived from the Spanish word cimarron, which originally applied to escaped cattle living in the wild, which later came to refer to people running away in order to escape enslavement. Now, the Maroons were enslaved indigenous people who moved to the hills in order to escape brutality of enslavement. Some Maroons were also Africans, brought during the slave trade. There were huge confrontations between the Maroons and the British people. One that started in 1655 sparked the first of the two Maroon Wars. A peace treaty was signed around 1739 or 1740, which granted each party some land. However, a second Maroon War was sparked in 1795, and that one ended in 1796 when the Maroons surrendered. The slaves rebelled in different ways, and the most prominent way was through rebellions and uprising. All right, so there was the Taki Rebellion in Jamaica in 1716. You also had the Barbados Rebellion in 1816 in Barbados, of course. You had the Baptist War, also called the Christmas Rebellion of 1831, which was a major rebellion in Jamaica in 1831 involving Sam Sharp. And you also had a major one in Jamaica in 1865 called the Morant Bay Rebellion. That involved George William Gordon and Paul Bogle. And also you had the Demerara Rebellion in Guyana in 1823 and the Berbice Slave Uprising or the Berbice Slave Revolt in Guyana in 1763. Should I put that in a different order though, like the Berbice before the Demerara? But I guess that's fine. Alright, after being carried to the Caribbean, there are many ways in which the slaves responded to oppression and the way in which they opposed the colonial rule. One way was by committing suicide. They also committed infanticide. That's where they killed their infants or their children, their babies, and they broke tools used for working on the plantation, and they also practiced malingering. That's where they pretended to be ill so that they wouldn't have to work. What this did was it would set back production on the plantations, and that wouldn't be really good for the European economy. Also, they started learning to read and write, so they practiced literacy, and there are many ways in which this was not acceptable, or this wasn't acceptable for many reasons. One being that it would kind of put them or start giving them a boost up the social ladder, because let's go back to communication studies for those who did that. So in the continuum, you had the baselect, you had the mesolect, and you had the acrolect. And the baselect was for those who or represented those of a lower class who spoke basically a broken language or a form of Creole, which isn't really understood that easily by just anyone. Also, you have the mesolect, which is like representation of middle class. And this would be where both the Creole and the standard English is spoken. Alright, and then you'd have the acrolect, which would be like representation of the higher class, maybe. And this is where only the standard English is spoken. right? So you can look at this on the social ladder. The blacks were the lowest of the lowest class and the whites were of the highest class. Them learning literacy and moving up that social ladder would mean that they're coming up to the class or a level of that of the Europeans or the whites. And that wasn't acceptable because based on how these blacks were treated, they weren't treated as people, they were treated as property, they were treated as animals. So them being on the ranks of the whites were just solely unacceptable. So that's how really getting literate would oppose the colonial rule. Also, becoming literate would allow them to better communicate between the plantations, and better communication means that they could better plan ways of escape and better plan rebellions and revolts. You see? So that's how really becoming literate opposed the colonial rule. Alright, so one of the most famous and successful revolutions in the Western Hemisphere was the Haitian Revolution, which started in 1791 after the French Revolution broke out in 1789. Now we saw people like Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint was a general and a former slave himself, right? And they led a battle. I think it's called the Battle of Vertières or Vertiers. Anyways, that was on in 1803, and the French forces were defeated because Haiti was under the colonial rule of the French at the time. It was called Saint-Domingue. Alright? And they were defeated, the French were defeated in 1803 at that battle. And what happened was on January 1st, New Year's Day, like drum no clap good yet. In 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines declared the nation's independence and renamed it to Haiti. And that was really what happened. That's the Haitian Revolution. If you want to know more about it, because there were so many other people involved, just not those two, but they were the most prominent at the time, you can read up about it. Apart from revolts on plantations, there were also revolts on slave ships, and a huge story about rebellions on ships or on a particular ship was the story about the Spanish ship La Amistad. So this was a major slave revolt on the Spanish-owned ship in about 1839 when captives from Sierra Leone who were kidnapped from their homes and were being brought to Cuba took control of the ship. What happened is covered in a movie called Amistad, directed by Steven Spielberg. So I guess you can check that out, but it mostly covers what happened in the courtroom. And this rebellion caught the attention of many and ended up challenging slavery in the United States. After moving off the plantations, there were different economic activities which the ex-slaves had taken up. One being partner, whichever is acceptable. And they also started small farming. They started their own small farms off the plantations, and that's where the beginning of peasantry began, because peasantry really means small farming. Huckstering is like being a vendor, so they sell in markets and stuff like that. Fishing and livestock farming, and they also went into retail, wholesale, and opening their own shops in towns. Alright? No, apart from engaging in economic activities, there were other ways in which the ex-slaves would rebel or oppose the colonial rule. Like there were the 1930s riots, and that was huge in Jamaica, I believe, those riots. But apart from that, they used Pan-Africanism and Rastafarianism. Alright? So some Pan-Africanists are like Marcus Messiah Garvey and Walter Rodney. You had many others during that time though, but I think those were the most prominent at the time. Alright, let's talk about the movement towards independence, okay? And this was a fantastic era, I tell you, believe me. So the movement towards independence was around the years 1970s or in the 1970s to about the early 1980s. And throughout this period, there were many processes which influenced and drove the movement towards independence. This period included the post-emancipation period up to about the end of the 19th century. Alright, firstly, let me introduce the term political enfranchisement. Alright, so this is the right of a people belonging to a particular country, territory, or nation to determine their own affairs, both internal and external. Okay, so what happened was the Caribbean people became woke. Hashtag woke baby right there. Yes, he be giving us some words of wisdom through his third eye. We just don't know it yet. So they realized that the different territories who had already achieved independence, such as like the United States of America, that got their independence or declared their independence in 1776, that they were in a better state really as this as the citizens were treated better and the conditions and the quality of life there was overall better. Also, by moving to different regional territories like Panama to work on the Panama Canal and the modern sugar plantations in Cuba, as well as different extra regional territories like the UK, remember the Windrush generation, they realized that, hey, there's better out there, really. The Caribbean people also became influenced by the ideas of Marcus Garvey, and this is where we saw the rise of Garveyism, which is an aspect of Black nationalism that refers to the economic, the racial, the political policies as well of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, founded by Marcus Garvey as well. Often you'll see this abbreviated as UNIA-ACL. And what this association did really was tell people or try to influence people into going back to your roots, really, telling the Blacks that remember who we were before we were oppressed. All right? And that is where we see an aspect of cultural renewal, and we'll go into these terms like cultural renewal, cultural norming, cultural homogeneity a bit in further topics or further videos. Should I say that? Yes, videos to come. All right, we'll go in those more detailed. Another Pan-Africanist was a man from Guyana named Walter Rodney, and he was responsible for the Rodney riots in Jamaica in 1968. He was eventually banned though, as well as his literature, but I think you should read more about that. I don't think because that's another story for another day, really. Anyways, for also a process of the movement towards independence era was the rise of trade unionism, and that actually had set the tone for things such as universal adult suffrage, internal self-government, and ultimately independence. All right, so there were a lot of labor riots in the 1930s, such as the Barbados Confederation riots. You also had the St. Vincent riots. And also a labor riot that was not in the 1930s was the 1865 Morant Bay Rebellion, and that was more than labor really. It was also disputing the unfair treatment that the blacks were still facing. Throughout the movement towards independence era, we also saw different governmental systems such as the old representative system straight through to the constitutional monarchy. And we also have a lot of constitutional monarchies here in the Caribbean because, all right, let's look at Jamaica. Jamaica is a constitutional monarchy because the monarchy shares power with our constitutionally organized government, meaning we have rules really, we have laws that govern our country, all right? And we also have a queen who is our head of state. And we have the governor general who really represents the queen. And we have our prime minister that governs internal affairs along with his parliament or cabinet. All right? So, the old representative system is a system we have the governor, the council, and the assembly. All right? I think the first House of Assembly in Jamaica was opened in 1664. All right. And after that, we moved on to what we call our crown colony government. And that's a colony under which the administration of the crown, where the governor is appointed by the monarch in charge. After that, we saw constitutional monarchy when we actually gained our independence and we actually got our first prime minister. And by getting our first prime minister, what we also got was a constitution, an organized set of laws, really, that governs our country. And through that, the constitutional monarchy has the monarch or queen, should I say, or queen, the queen, really, as our head of state, being represented by a governor general, which we have. And what happens is we work, or our country's affairs are managed co-representatively through the constitutional monarchy as well as our own constitution. I think I explained that properly. So, in truth and in fact, there is shared power between the monarch and our own constitutional government. And that's basically what the constitutional monarchy is. We also saw universal adult suffrage coming into play because that is really the right of a people to vote regardless of their gender, social class, economic circumstances, or even race. All right? And different Caribbean territories achieved universal adult suffrage during different times, really, or different periods. So Jamaica achieved universal adult suffrage in 1944 and held their first general elections under universal adult suffrage in the month of December. St. Lucia saw universal adult suffrage in 1951, and so did St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and St. Kitts came right after in 1952. So what you have the St. Lucia and then St. Vincent and the Grenadines, so two saints, right? First, and then you have the St. Kitts, which is really above all those, so having a bigger year or a bigger number, 1952, and Montserrat, which is literally almost, I shouldn't say beside St. Kitts, but it's not beside, but it's like, just look at the map and you'll see that St. Kitts is really close to Montserrat, so 1952 for both of those. Then you have Trinidad and Tobago, 1945, sounds like a round number, so that's supposed to be good. 1945 for Trinidad. You have Barbados 1950, and then Guyana achieving that in 1953. And then we had internal self-government. Alright, after universal adult suffrage, we saw the introduction of internal self-government, right? And the different Caribbean territories obtained the opportunity to manage the territory's domestic affairs. However, the metropoles or the colonizers still controlled the country's external affairs, alright? So Jamaica obtained internal self-government in 1957, alright? Just a bit after they got universal adult suffrage in 1944. Now remember, universal adult suffrage allowed people to vote no matter their gender, social class, wealth, or race, stuff like that. So what this gave internal self-government now, what this pushed for was that the Africans or the blacks as well as the Indians were now allowed to vote, and this gave blacks and Indians an opportunity to be elected to office. Through them being elected to office, or because what was formed was a legislature, so with them being able to be elected to office, they could further push for independence because they now had a say as to what happened internally or domestically in the country. Alright, so that's basically what internal self-government was. However, there were some hiccups as per this because the ex-slaves were moving off plantations, and as I said earlier, that was how we saw the development of peasant groups with small farmers. So they started their small farms, however, it wasn't really enough. So now we're going to move on to economic enfranchisement and speak about these small farms. Alright, and the different entrepreneurial activities. After some time, the Caribbean people started to push for economic enfranchisement, and I took this from the Caribbean Studies for Examinations textbook. A country or a nation's right to determine how it will develop its systems of production, and the Caribbean people use this as a way of resisting oppression. So they try to find ways to make a living, and as I said, the peasant groups played a major part in this because they started with cash crops, all right? And a major cash crop at the time was sugarcane. Eventually, the cash value for sugarcane started to go down, and they had to find different cash crops, right? So they moved to ginger, coconuts, what else? Ground provision, coffee, as well as a different cash crop. And this is how they diversified the local economy by selling a variety of crops in the markets and stuff like that. So what was happening was the Caribbean people no longer wanted their economy to be controlled by the Europeans. And so they were really pushing for independence. After some time, the European people made rent for lands unbearably high. They started evicting these ex-slaves as well. And so it was becoming a really terrible situation for the ex-slaves to make money in such an economy, right? So what happened was they started developing free villages, which was for the purpose of having these ex-slaves have land in order to actually, farm on. These free villages to obtain these free villages, they were helped through Baptist ministers. And the first free village in the Western Hemisphere was Sligoville. Alright? but I think if you Google it, you're going to find, let me try and remember. Sturge, is it Sterntown or Sturgetown? Sturgetown, somewhere in St. Anne. That would come up, but the conspiracy with that is that the first actual registered free village was Sligoville in 1835, and that was founded by Reverend James Filippo, and he was a Baptist minister in Spanish Town. And what happened was Sturgetown was the second registered free village in the Western Hemisphere, and that town was registered in 1838. All right. So the first free village is Sligoville. All right. So that should be great. And by obtaining these free villages, the ex-slaves were, free to farm on their land, and, they get the land really. Also, after some time, financing became kind of hard, so they needed means to obtain money, such as loan and stuff like that. So they opened saving societies. Eventually, saving societies were like overtaken by commercial banks, but there's still some credit unions and saving societies open today. And that is really the end of this video. So once again, guys, if you're hearing this, that means you've made it to the end of the video. Congratulations. You know what to do. Subscribe, like. Let me hear your comments in the comments box below. And until next time, stay breezy.